My name is Nadia Okoye. I'm 29 years old. 5 months ago, I sat in the waiting room of a probate attorney's office in Hartford, Connecticut, next to a woman I had not spoken to in 3 years, my father's new wife, Colette, while a paralegal sorted documents on the other side of a frosted glass partition. My father was in the room too, in the chair farthest from me, wearing the expression he had perfected over the years. Composed, reasonable, the face of a man who has never done anything that required explanation. He had been telling people for 3 years that I was estranged by choice, that I had decided, on my own, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, to remove myself from the family. That he had tried. That some children simply pull away, and what can a parent do? He had said this to Colette, to her 2 sons, to his colleagues, to the extended family who asked at holidays where I was. What he had not told any of them was the timeline. The timeline existed because my grandmother, his mother, Grandma Cecile, had existed. She had been a retired paralegal for 31 years who believed that the precise sequence of events was the only honest version of any story. She had kept a record, and when she died 8 months ago at 83, her attorney, a woman named Margaret Solis, had in her possession a sealed document addressed to the executor of the estate, with a secondary envelope addressed specifically to me, and a cover note that said, "To be opened in the presence of both my son and my granddaughter. If my son contests this, read it anyway." Before I tell you what happened in that room, please like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Growing up in Hartford, I learned that my father was a man who was very good at the version of events that made him comfortable, and very skilled at finding audiences who would accept it. My family. Dad. Franklin, financial advisor, charming in the specific way of people who have practiced charm until it becomes indistinguishable from sincerity. My mother had died when I was 11, a car accident on a Tuesday morning that rearranged everything, and after that it was just the 2 of us for 4 years, and then it was the 2 of us and whoever Franklin was seeing, and then it was whoever Franklin was seeing and, increasingly, not me. My grandmother Cecile, my father's mother, my mother's biggest champion, the woman who had sat with me in the hospital waiting room when I was 11 and held my hand without saying anything because she understood that some moments don't have language. And my father's new wife, Colette, whom he had married 2 years ago, who had 2 sons in their mid-20s, and who had been told a specific story about why his daughter wasn't at the wedding. I was not at the wedding because I had not been invited. I want to say that plainly because my father's version of it required softening. His version was that things had been difficult between us, that I was going through a hard time, that he hadn't wanted to put me in an uncomfortable position. The actual sequence was, he called me 6 days before the ceremony to tell me it was happening. 6 days. After 4 months of not returning my calls. He said he hoped I understood that it was going to be a small, intimate thing, and he hadn't wanted to make it complicated. I said I didn't understand, actually. That 6 days wasn't an invitation, it was a notification. He said I was making it about myself. That was the last conversation we had before the estrangement he would later describe as my choice. When I was 15, my father started dating a woman named Patricia who had a son my age. For approximately 8 months, I watched my father become the version of himself he had apparently always been capable of being. Present, engaged, remembering details, showing up to things. For someone else's child. He went to that boy's soccer games, learned his class schedule, argued, cheerfully, about his opinions on movies. I was 15, and I told myself I was being jealous and small. At 17, I needed a recommendation letter for a college scholarship application. The deadline was a Thursday. I had asked my father in September, when the school year started, if he would write one. He had said, "Of course, absolutely, send me the details." I sent the details 3 times over 2 months. On the Wednesday before the deadline, I called him at work, and his assistant said he was in a client meeting and could she take a message. I found a teacher who wrote the letter in 18 hours. I got the scholarship. When I told my father, he said, "See, you handled it." I was 17 and I told myself that was true, that I was capable, that handling it alone was the same as being supported. The most severe moment came at 23. My mother had left me a small inheritance, $18,000, held in a trust administered by my father until I turned 25. When I asked about it at 23, wanting to understand what it contained, he said there had been fees, management costs. He said the account had underperformed. He said these things in the reasonable, composed tone of a financial advisor, explaining market conditions to a client who didn't fully understand the market. Grandma Cecile, who had been present for this conversation at the kitchen table, was quiet through all of it. 2 days later, she called me. "I want you to talk to an attorney," she said. "Not to make trouble, just to understand your rights." I asked her what she knew. "I know your mother meant that money for you," she said, "and I know your father is very good at explaining why things aren't what they appear to be." I was 23 and I filed the paperwork. The process took 11 months. The final amount recovered was $14,200, some legitimate fees, some that were not. My father signed the transfer without comment and did not speak to me for 7 months after. When he started speaking to me again, he told the story as mutual distance, as a rough patch, as something that had simply happened, the way weather happens. But all of that was just preparation for what came next. Grandma Cecile had been declining for 2 years before she died. Not dramatically, she was the kind of woman who declined on her own terms, managing her affairs with the precision she had applied to everything, making sure the edges were clean. She called me every Sunday until she couldn't, and then she texted, and then her neighbor Frances would text on her behalf with brief updates that were clearly Cecile's words typed by someone else's hands. She never once indicated what she had been building. What I know now from Margaret Solis is that Cecile had begun documenting 3 years before she died. She had kept a journal, not a personal diary, something more structured than that, something that reflected her 31 years as a paralegal. Dates, conversations, direct quotes where she had them, paraphrases where she didn't, clearly labeled so there was no confusion between the two. The trust dispute, the wedding notification, the years before, the pattern she had watched for 2 decades as her son rearranged the story of his daughter's life to suit the audience he was performing for. She had done this, she wrote in the cover letter, because she had loved her son and loved her granddaughter and understood that those 2 loves were going to outlast her, and she wanted the record to exist even when she didn't. She had also done something else. My mother's family, her parents, both deceased, had left a secondary provision in an estate I had never known existed. My mother had been one of 3 children. The provision had sat dormant, administered by an independent executor, waiting for me to turn 30 or for my paternal grandmother to release it, whichever came first. Grandma Cecile had been the release mechanism. She had built that into the document herself, 17 years ago, working in concert with my mother's family's attorney before the woman retired. She had been watching over this since I was 12 years old. The amount was $67,000. My mother's parents had been modest people with a paid-off house that had appreciated, and they had left it in thirds, and my third had been sitting in a managed account for 17 years, gathering careful, unglamorous interest. Margaret Solis had also been holding Cecile's journal, the full document, the dates and the quotes and the timeline. Cecile's instructions were specific. It was to be read aloud at the estate proceeding, in its entirety in my father's presence. He had not been told it existed until he walked into the office. I need to tell you about Frances before I tell you about the room. Frances Akello was Cecile's neighbor of 24 years, a retired nurse who brought my grandmother soup on Wednesdays, and had, over the course of their friendship, become the closest thing Cecile had to a daily witness. She knew the whole story. She had heard Cecile's accounting of it over 2 decades of Wednesday soup and Sunday afternoon conversations on the porch. Frances had also, at Cecile's request, flown in from Hartford the week before the estate proceeding. She sat in the waiting room when I arrived. I hadn't known she would be there. She stood up when she saw me and took both my hands and said, "She wanted someone here who loved you. She didn't want you to be alone in that room." I held it together, barely. Margaret Solis was in her late 50s, with the precise and unhurried manner of someone who had been delivering difficult documents to complicated families for 30 years and had made peace with the work. She brought us into the conference room, my father, Colette, me, Frances, and arranged the folders on the table without preamble. My father looked at Frances with polite confusion. I'm sorry, are you part of the estate proceedings? I'm here as a witness, Frances said. Cecile's instructions. He looked at Margaret. She confirmed it with a small nod and opened the first folder. The estate itself was modest. The house, some savings, personal items. My father was the primary heir, which Cecile had kept standard for her own reasons. There was a bequest to Frances. There was the secondary provision releasing my mother's family inheritance to me. When Margaret read that figure, $67,000, my father's expression shifted for just a moment. A small recalibration. He hadn't known about the account. Neither had I until 3 weeks earlier when Margaret had called to prepare me. Colette looked at him. He looked at the table. Then Margaret picked up the second folder. Cecile Okoye also left a documented record, she said, prepared in her capacity as a former paralegal and witnessed by 2 independent parties. She requested it be read aloud. I'm going to do that now. My father straightened in his chair. What kind of record? A timeline, Margaret said, of events relating to your daughter. The room was very quiet. Margaret began to read. The document was 14 pages. Margaret read it in the measured, unhurried voice of someone reading testimony into record. She did not editorialize. She did not pause for reaction. She read the dates and the quotes and the characterizations, clearly labeled throughout as observation or direct quotation, the distinctions my grandmother had been careful to maintain. The scholarship letter I had needed at 17. Quoted from a conversation Cecile had witnessed at the kitchen table the following Christmas, in which my father had said, "She's resourceful. She doesn't need the same things other kids need." The trust dispute at 23. The fees. The 11 months. The amount recovered. The phone call 6 days before the wedding. Cecile had been in the room when my father made it. She had written the date, the time, and his exact words. I didn't want to make it complicated. The 3 years since. The specific language my father had used with Colette's family, which Cecile had heard at a dinner she'd attended 14 months ago. Nadia is estranged by choice. Some children decide they want distance and you have to respect that. He had said this while passing the breadbasket. Cecile had written it down when she got home. The document concluded with a paragraph in a different register from the rest. Less formal, more personal. The only section where Cecile departed from the paralegal voice and wrote as a grandmother. Margaret read it without inflection. I have loved my son for 61 years. I do not write this to destroy him. I write it because the truth of what happened to my granddaughter should exist somewhere outside her own memory, where it cannot be revised or managed or explained away. Nadia was not estranged by choice. She was pushed to a distance by a series of specific choices made by her father, documented above. She deserved better. She has always deserved better. I am leaving her this record as a gift, which is what the truth is when it comes late. Not justice, exactly, but something close to it. The relief of being seen accurately. I want her to have that. I want her to carry it forward. The room was silent for a long moment. My father had not moved in the last 4 pages. Colette had stopped looking at the table and was now looking at her husband with an expression I recognized. Not shock, exactly, but the specific expression of a person encountering a different version of a story they thought they already knew. Frances, beside me, put her hand on the table near mine without touching it. Present. Available. My father said finally, "My mother was not always... She had a particular perspective." Franklin. Margaret Solis's voice was quiet and final. "This is a legal document. The record stands as read." He closed his mouth. I looked at him. I had thought, in the weeks preparing for this, about what I would want to say. I had rehearsed versions of it with my therapist, drafted things in notes on my phone at 2 a.m, arrived at and discarded a dozen formulations. In the room, I said none of them. I said, "She saw me, even when you didn't. She made sure I'd know it." My father looked at me for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not the composed expression, not the reasonable face, something underneath it, older and less managed. He said, "I know." Just that. I don't know what he meant by it, Whether he meant "I know she saw you," or "I know I failed you," or "I know I've been caught," or all three at once. I have sat with that sentence for 5 months, and I have stopped trying to parse it into certainty. Some things don't resolve into clean meaning. They just exist, complicated and true, like most things that matter. Colette asked to speak with me privately before we left the building. We stood in the hallway while my father waited near the elevator. She said, "I didn't know the full story." "I know," I said. "I want you to know that the door isn't closed," she said. "Whatever you decide. From my side, it isn't closed." I told her I appreciated that. I meant it with appropriate uncertainty. The weeks after were quiet ones. My father called twice. I let both go to voicemail. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I wasn't yet sure what shape the conversation should have, and I had learned, slowly, expensively, that entering conversations before I knew what I wanted from them cost more than waiting. Frances flew home. She sends me a voice message every few weeks, brief updates in the warm, matter-of-fact tone that is entirely her own. She told me once that Cecile had made her promise to stay in touch. "She said you'd need someone who had known your mother," Frances told me. She was right. My mother's inheritance was transferred in full. I sat with a financial advisor I had found independently and made careful decisions. I paid off my remaining student loans, $11,400. I set aside an emergency fund that would have mattered enormously at 17, and at 23, and at 26. The rest is invested in an account with my name on it, administered by no one but me. My grandmother's journal, the original, not the copy entered into legal record, was sent to me by Margaret Solis in a padded envelope with a handwritten note that said simply, "She wanted you to have this. It is in a box in my closet. I have read it once. I will read it again when I am ready." The handwriting is hers, familiar as a childhood smell, precise and slightly forward-leaning, the hand of a woman who believed that the exact word was always worth the extra effort. My father and I spoke for the first time 6 weeks after the proceeding. A short call. Careful. He did not perform composure this time. He was quieter than I had ever heard him, which is a different quality from composed. He said he had been in therapy, something that surprised me, and which I received without comment. He said he had been thinking about choices. I told him that I was willing to try, slowly, to find out if there was something real left between us. That trying didn't mean pretending. That I would not accept another version of events that required me to be the one who chose distance. He said he understood. I don't know yet what it will become. I have stopped needing to know in advance. What I carry now is simpler than a plan. It is Cecile's 14 pages. It is Frances's voice messages. It is a number with 5 zeros that my mother's parents quietly saved for the granddaughter they wanted to protect from a distance, administered by a woman who had loved me for 60 years and made sure the truth would survive her. It is the relief, as she wrote, of being seen accurately. If you're watching this and someone in your life has been narrating your story without you, telling rooms full of people a version of events that requires your silence to hold together, I want you to say something directly to you. You are allowed to have the facts. You are allowed to want them. You are not obligated to accept a version of your own life that was written to protect someone else's comfort. The truth does not require their cooperation to be true. Sometimes it just needs someone meticulous and loving to write it down, seal it in an envelope, and make sure it outlasts the silence. Find your Cecile. Be your own Cecile if you have to. And when the timeline finally arrives, let it be enough. Not everything, not the end of pain, not a perfect accounting. Just the relief of it. Just being seen. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this resonated, please like and subscribe. I want to ask you something in the comments. Has someone ever kept a record on your behalf? Documented something you were too close to see clearly? Or held a truth for you until you were ready for it? What did that feel like? Drop your answer below. I read every one. Until next time, the accurate version of your story exists. Hold on to it.